7th and final Freight Advisory Committee working meeting before our team has the draft freight plan ready for your review and discussion this summer. So as a reminder to everyone, the planning team supporting DOT and the Long Range Transportation Plan update includes Kittleson, Michael Baker, Northern Economics, and Huddle. And though Holly isn't able to join us today, I'll be running through our kind of typical introductory slides, and then I'll pass the microphone over to Brian. And meanwhile, Michelle and Wendy will be monitoring the chat and kind of helping to facilitate some of our conversation later on. So we've got quite a bit of information to cover today. Our agenda just about follows the same outline as the meeting packet, which Holly sent over last Wednesday. So we'll give a high-level project process update, provide an update on the PHFS redesignation opportunity that we spent several meetings discussing last fall. Brian will give an overview of the infrastructure bill and what it means for this freight plan update for Alaska. And then we'll move on to discussing project screening criteria, and we'll close the freight plan next steps. And just a reminder, as folks continue trickling in, if you could just verify you're muted till we get to discussion, that would be appreciated. So since the beginning of the project nearly 14 months ago, we've completed the data collection and analysis phase last fall, and over the past few months, we've been focused on the strategic direction phase, which included defining vision, goals, and performance measures, an ongoing exploratory scenario planning effort, and beginning to pull everything together into the draft long-range transportation and freight plans. And like I mentioned earlier, these documents will be ready for your review early summertime. So first up, we wanted to give an update on the PHFS redesignation opportunity that came out from FHWA last fall that we had a few meetings discussing. So after our series of meetings last fall and survey, DOT sent a response letter to FHWA in mid-December. This letter emphasized the preference for designating the PHFS candidates of the Steese-Elliott Highway from Fairbanks to the start of the Dalton Highway firstly, and pending mileage availability, acknowledged the importance of the Seward Highway from the Sterling Highway to the Port of Seward. The letter also commented to FHWA on the limited mileage availability to Alaska, depending upon the division methodology that they used, and acknowledged that the Steese-Elliott mileage request would likely exceed what would be available. There also was some highlighted information acknowledging the Dalton Highway as a critical rural freight corridor for the state, while noting the limited mileage availability means it's hard to designate the full length with logical termini and doesn't allow for designation of additional rural freight corridors statewide. Anything else we want to add here, Eric, or shall we move on?
I think you covered it.
All right. Great. Well, I'll go ahead and pass the microphone over to Brian to start walking us through the update on the infrastructure bill.
All right. Thank you, Claire. Can you hear me? Mic check. Okay. All right. Thank you and good afternoon, everyone. We'll just start our portion of the presentation with an overview of the passage of the new law, the IIJA, or you've probably heard it referred to as bill. And for the past 6 years, we've been doing business under the FAST Act, and that expired last September. And as probably all of us are fully aware by now, Congress had passed this new law. The president signed it into law back on November 15th. And it's been known as IIJA, or the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill. I've heard it referred to both ways, and we've heard representatives from FHWA indicate that they're going to be referring to it as bill. But however you refer to it, it does represent the most significant increase in transportation funding, frankly, since Alaska became a state. Over the 5-year life of the law, Alaska is slated to receive, $3.4 billion for federal aid highway apportion programs and $225 million for bridge replacement and repairs. So beyond that, we've got a few slides that really document what does the new law mean with regard to Alaska's freight plan. What does it mean to planning for freight moving forward. The good news is that the formula programs that we're all familiar with from the FAST Act, they're all gonna survive. They're gonna carry forward as part of the new law. So all of the formula funding programs are gonna carry forward. There's also two new formula funding programs called Protect and another one on carbon reduction. And the Protect program is really just aimed at addressing resiliency, and it's valued at $7.3 billion nationwide. Likewise, the carbon reduction program is similarly capitalized, just under $7 billion, and it's going to provide formula grants to all the states to reduce transportation emissions or in the development of carbon reduction strategies. In addition to the formula programs, there's also, over 20 new discretionary programs, and it's just mind-boggling as you page through the pages of the law. Not only the additional dollars that are going to be available, but also a plethora of new programs, new discretionary programs that Alaska is going to be able to compete for. So there's going to be a variety of discretionary programs ranging from a $12 billion bridge investment program to a $5 billion program for so-called mega projects under the National Infrastructure Project Assistance Program. So again, a lot of exciting new programs that have been created as part of the law, and again, opportunities for Alaska to compete for these funding dollars through these new discretionary programs. One of the surprises that our team experienced in just comparing the new law, comparing that with the FAST Act, one of the surprises we saw was in relation to the National Highway Freight Program funding, or the NHFP funding program. And surprisingly, we're seeing a slight decrease in apportionments for the NHFP program. So you'll recall that typically Alaska has been receiving upwards of 20 million every year. I think last federal fiscal year, the figure was just shy of 19 million. So you just compare that with some of the figures you see there on the slide, and it's a slight decrease from the numbers we're used to seeing from the FAST Act. And again, the NHFP dollars, this is the primary reason, or one of the primary reasons, that we're developing a statewide freight plan, because without the freight plan, Alaska is not eligible to receive any of these NHFP dollars. So very important. If you don't have a freight plan, we're disqualified from receiving this funding stream. The next slide, in addition to roadways and bridges, there's also funding available for other freight modes. Looking at airports, the new law provides $25 billion for aviation facilities nationwide. And this is for facilities and equipment, for airport infrastructure, and for airport terminals. And some of these are grant programs that are aimed at improving not only the development of airport terminals, but also for access roads that would support airport traffic, as well as improvements to multimodal terminal buildings and development. Port infrastructure development program grants, there's slightly over $2 billion available nationwide there. Again, for competitive grants to modernize and expand our ports, to remove bottlenecks and ensure the long-term economic competitiveness of our ports. And so some example projects there under that program would be projects that would improve port resiliency from extreme weather events, earthquakes, or other projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. In addition to the additional funding and additional programs that are going to be available for Alaska, there are also a few other important implications with regard to bill as it relates to our freight plan. You see the points there on the screen. And the new law is really increasing the frequency that the states are going to be required to update their state freight plans. Previously, we were on a 5-year cycle. The new law is shortening that cycle to a 4-year period. So we are seeing a heavier emphasis by the feds on freight planning compared to the LRTP. And so that is borne out in the new law. Some other new requirements that we're seeing, groups such as yourselves, the Freight Advisory Committee, the feds are requiring local government participation on state freight advisory committees. So we want to ensure that local interests, local perspectives are being accounted for and considered as part of the overall statewide planning process. You'll recall too at some prior meetings, the work that this group has been involved in. Claire had some discussion on the PHFS. We took a closer look at critical urban and critical rural freight corridors. And there was some criticism, not only here in Alaska, but also nationwide with regard to the amount of mileage that could be included as part of this priority freight network. And so the new law has responded to those concerns. And you see some of the numbers there as they pertain to Alaska. And we wanted to include what the current law, or at least the FAST Act, provided for as it pertained to Alaska. You see the current certified critical rural freight corridor mileage, 235 miles on the Dalton Highway was designated by the state and then certified by FHWA. And again, you see the differences there that the new law is going to allow for Alaska up to 600 miles or 25% of your PHFS mileage, whichever is greater. And the greater number is the 600-mile figure. So again, you see an opportunity there going forward for this group to continue to work with the department and with your MPOs and other stakeholders in actual designating additional mileage for these priority freight corridors. And again, these designations would make those roadway segments eligible for that NHFP funding. So again, a lot of opportunities there going forward. We wanted to cover a few topics related to the priority freight projects. And again, this is one of the primary distinctions between the statewide freight plan and the LRTP, in that the freight plan is a not only a policy plan, but it's also a project-oriented plan. And it will include a listing of projects that are fiscally constrained and documented as part of the freight plan's freight investment plan.
Hey, Brian, before you get too far down this, can we take a couple of questions? Jody had a question. Are protect and carbon reduction specific only to highways for the bill?
I am not sure of the answer to that. Those are details I'd have to follow up on and get back to you on.
Okay, perfect.
But my sense is that yes, they would be under the highway program. Are there other hands or questions I may have missed?
And Jody had another follow-up. Are freight corridors only defined in terms of roadways, or are water, air, and rail also part of them? And my understanding is the interconnectivity is definitely part of this new freight plan and expands some eligibility there.
You're right, Wendy. Maybe we could go back, Claire, maybe go back a slide or two. There is a sub-bullet. Go back two more. Yeah, that's a good point, Wendy. And one sub-bullet we should point out, the very last bullet point on that page, and this is another important distinction from the FAST Act with regard to our NHFP dollars. You know, a majority of that funding is going on the roadway network. There was up to 10% that was available for freight intermodal and freight rail projects. The new law is increasing that allowance up to 30%. So it does give the states a little more flexibility to use those dollars into other modes of freight transportation. But in terms of priority corridors, just going back to the question, we are looking primarily at the roadway network, although there are other priority freight assets certainly that have been identified through, keeping in mind there's a federal priority network as well as a state identified priority network, and that includes, a broader range of multimodal freight assets, including, the railroads and the pipelines and things of that nature.
Good questions. Thank you, Jody. Anyone else? Are you ready to dive into the meat of it? This is where you all want to jump in.
All right, we'll move then into a discussion on the freight investment plan. This is really the heart, as Wendy indicated, this is the heart of the freight plan, looking at the projects that are going to be flowing out of the freight plan or included within the freight investment plan. So in this regard, it's somewhat similar. If any of you have been involved in working with long-range transportation plans at the MPO level anyway, you'll know that projects within these MPO LRTPs are more than just a wish list. And the same is true for the statewide freight plan. It's more than just a listing of projects or a wish list of projects, but the feds require us to be able to document how we're spending our apportionment of NHFP dollars. All right, so we need to be able to document, which projects are using NHFP dollars. Are there other types of funding, whether it's state or federal dollars that are being used to fund freight projects? Those need to be documented and referenced within the freight plan. So this is very timely. It's very important to note that a financially constrained or a fiscally constrained freight investment plan, it's good policy. It's a sound policy approach at any time, really considering the wide gap that exists between, the resources that are available to the department put up against the annual investment need. So again, it's a very important aspect of the freight investment plan that we're documenting the amount of revenue that we have available to spend, against the projects that are included within this particular program or freight investment plan. That's a good segue to our next slide, which speaks to a very important planning principle, and that is, the purpose of good planning is to be able to ensure that we have good programming. Good planning informs good decision making, and so we want the freight investment plan to be guided by the directions, the strategic directions of not only the LRTP, but also certainly the freight plan. And ultimately, we want the freight investment plan to drive the composition of the STIP. One should be driving the other. One of the challenges that we have, though, this has been complicated by the development process for the STIP and the FIP are both being developed simultaneously. So I think in a perfect world, we'd all like to see the freight plan really drive the composition of the STIP. But we're in a situation now with both of these planning processes moving forward side by side. We're just in a situation where we need to be able to have an approved freight plan to be able to document to the feds that we have a freight investment plan that's fiscally constrained, and at the same time, see those projects carry forward into an amended STIP. And again, you see the dates there on the screen. We're looking for a freight plan adoption later this summer in the August timeframe, and we're anticipating an adopted STIP sometime in the September timeframe, certainly sometime before October 1st. So that's our challenge. How will the freight projects be advanced? Well, again, we need to make sure that any freight project that's going to be using NHFP funding is included, spoken for, documented, however you want to say it. We need to make sure that it's included within the freight investment plan. We need to be able to document that it's fiscally constrained, that it's more than just a wish list, and we need to be able to document any other matching funds or any other funding categories that the state is using in order to advance that particular project. For our discussion this afternoon, it's important to note that we have two lists of freight projects. We have a listing of projects that are fiscally constrained. We have a listing of projects that are beyond fiscal constraint. and that's important to note. I would recognize these projects as projects that are eligible but unfunded. But at the same time, we didn't want to lose sight of these candidates. Many of these projects came from the Freight Advisory Committee, came from other freight stakeholders, motor carriers, the MPOs, and others. And whether or not they're fiscally constrained or not, we didn't want to lose sight of these potential projects, these candidate projects. So they are going to be included as part of the state freight plan as a listing of projects that could be considered for future programming, for future steps. Okay, so again, we are going to be documenting those project suggestions as part of the statewide freight plan. And then beyond that, we want to be looking at some things that we're looking at to really screen future freight projects. What kind of criteria should we be considering to really evaluate the merits of future freight projects? And that's something we're going to be discussing in a little more detail here in a few moments.
And Brian, we have a hand up.
Oh,
Jody?
I'm sorry. Jody again.
That's okay. We're gonna have to teach you how to breathe, Brian, so we can interject.
Sorry.
Jody,
Hi
you wanna
there.
go ahead?
Yeah, thank you. Can you just clarify for me sort of the framework? So do we have the LRTP and then the freight investment plan is a subset of the LRTP and the STIP is also a subset of the LRTP? I don't understand how these three plans go together
Okay.
and exactly which one are we working on right now?
Sure. Good question. I think number
Sorry.
one, the most important distinction to make is that the STIP is not a plan. It's a program. So the
And what's
project
the difference?
Pardon?
What's the difference? The STIP is a program and the LRTP is a plan. The STIP is like, we're going forward, it's funded, we're moving.
I would
Okay.
I would characterize the STIP as the
It's a
primary.
spending plan. Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah, the STIP is one of the primary ways that the LRTP and the freight plan are implemented. So there's no policy within the STIP. It is a list of projects that the state has programmed for funding. So with that in mind, the LRTP is distinct from the STIP. The freight plan is distinct from the STIP. However, the freight investment plan that we're talking about here, the freight investment plan is a component of the freight plan.
So think of it this way, Jody. Think of it as the long-range transportation plan is the policy guide. It says this is where we want all modes of transportation to go in the state of Alaska. So it's your big umbrella. Everything that comes, every plan that comes down before that should be helping achieve the goals in the long-range transportation plan. So it's kind of the blueprint, the guiding document. So we've got our house outlined, but we don't really have any details in our house, right? The freight plan is specific to freight. It starts to get into a little more specificity, and then it starts to say, here's the freight projects we think are really important. And then ideally, the STIP is going to pull from the freight plan and carry those projects forward. And I'm oversimplifying, but it's the family of plans. And so you start to get this hierarchy. And what you hope is you have alignment so that every plan out there is suddenly working towards this common goal.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question. And over the years, I've certainly seen it happen where whether an MPO or a DOT, they'll work on a plan, they'll develop the strategic directions. That's the front half of the plan. And then they'll have a list of projects and they'll staple them together. And that becomes the plan. That's really not the right way to go about it. We certainly want the strategic directions, our goals, our action strategies, our policy. We want that to drive, what kinds of projects find their way onto the STIP.
Thank you.
Okay. Good question. Any others? Any other hands up?
Keep going.
Okay. All right, we'll take a look at current projects that we have on the STIP. And again, this is, I believe this is the only project on the STIP that is using NHFP dollars. And it's a portion of the reconstruction of the Dalton Highway. So for the current draft freight investment plan, we're looking at, carrying over, projects from the previous freight plan, any projects from the previous plan that are still relevant, in addition to any of the new candidate projects that have been suggested or recommended by the Freight Advisory Committee and other stakeholders. So that really brings us up to a discussion point here. The discussion packet that was included in the mailing. And Claire, I'll turn it over to you for this piece.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. So for today's discussion on freight projects and where we want to go with those, for the sake of time, we're hoping to focus the discussion with this larger group on the freight planning process, with the goal being identifying freight project screening criteria to inform a transparent approach on how freight priority projects are carried forward for programming in the future. So while we're not going to walk through all 80+ projects that we listed in the freight packet that came from interviews with you, input during meetings last fall from DOT planner kind of priority freight lists at the regional level, the packet sent out last Wednesday does have the detailed list. I think it's about 4 pages, a bulleted list of about 80 projects. And we'd encourage all of you to review that list and feel free to provide any feedback, whether it's in the chat or via email after this meeting, if there are specific priority projects or if something is missing. But we're hoping to focus today's time on discussing that screening criteria that Brian started alluding to for we've got this long list of wish list projects. They're not fiscally constrained. How moving forward should these freight projects be screened and prioritized for future programming? And I'll just note too that there will be another opportunity to comment on the more detailed freight planning list during review of the draft freight plan early this summer.
Okay, thanks, Claire, for that overview and really helping to lay the groundwork for this portion of the meeting. And again, as a performance-based plan, the updated freight plan actually does include a specific recommendation back in the strategic directions. If you'll recall, the freight plan includes a recommendation for the state to establish a methodology for evaluating freight projects. So this is really a starting point. Frankly, you could say we're beginning implementation already by taking a look at these screening criteria. So again, this is going to be very important from the standpoint of giving the department a framework for evaluating future candidate freight projects, to be able to evaluate, the merits of a candidate freight project against similar projects, recognizing the restrictions that exist, in using federal dollars. Some of the federal dollars can only be used for certain types of projects. There is some flexing that exists from some programs to others, but for the most part, we need to do that in a way that recognizes the restrictions on spending of different types of federal dollars. So our next slide really introduces a draft set of screening criteria. And the project team is just putting these on the table for discussion today. I think we had reached out to the Freight Advisory Committee earlier on additional criteria. We want to start with these that you see here on the screen as a starting point for discussion. And are there any other criteria that the department needs to be considering in the future in evaluating candidate projects? So just going down through the list here, I'm just going to touch on each one of these, and then we'll just introduce a time of discussion, questions, or other comments, or perspectives or insights that you may have with regard to how to further define or further shape this list. But beginning first with safety, these criteria aren't shown in any kind of priority order, but if they were, I think safety would be number one. And so we would want to be looking at projects that really consider, the safety aspects, improving the safety of the network. And so there's many risks that exist in our freight infrastructure. We could talk about, the transportation of crude oil, to the effects of climate change and the vulnerabilities that exist there, to include safety as one of our evaluation criteria. So for example, for a roadway related project, we can look at methodologies like network screening tools to be able to evaluate the crash history of a roadway segment. We can look at the roadway factors, traffic characteristics that might contribute to future crashes, and really help the department to identify and prioritize locations for potential freight safety investment. The next category we're proposing, the team is proposing, is related to networks. And this group has spent a fair amount of time evaluating and prioritizing priority freight networks for the state, including both state designations as well as federal designations. And so the intent here with this particular criteria, the intent would be if we have a project, a proposed project that touches any one of these priority freight networks, that it would receive higher consideration for programming. So we really believe that the use of networks and identifying priority freight networks as a project screening approach really helps us to introduce the spatial aspects of the state's freight priorities, and it sends a message to the public and freight stakeholders alike of the most important routes where freight is moving and where special attention to freight issues are the most warranted. So it's an opportunity for us as an advisory committee, as the Department of Transportation, to be able to say to the public and to the state freight stakeholders, these are the routes, these are the assets that we believe are the most critical for the movement of freight in Alaska. The next criteria deals with the funding side of the equation, and it really elevates the role of the private sector and private sector dollars and investment in a candidate project. I know we just talked about billions of dollars that are going to be made available to Alaska here over the coming years, but this criteria would really address projects that rely less on state funding. So if we have a private sector interest that is willing to put some money into a certain project, that would really help the department to expand its project portfolio by distributing the limited resources that it has across a wider array of freight projects. So we're looking at the financial side of things as well, and possibly giving higher priority to projects that include private sector participation. Intermodal connectivity. I think we all recognize and value the importance of intermodalism and the importance of being able to transfer freight from one mode of transportation to another. The movement of freight certainly relies on multiple modes of transportation, and that ease in intermodal transfer really allows shippers to use the most cost-effective mode of freight transport and to be able to facilitate a more efficient movement of freight across the entire system. So we believe intermodal connectivity should be an important consideration. Likewise, this next one here, local plan alignment. And this deals with local priorities, local land use, And I think within the freight transportation community, there's a growing understanding that land use planning and freight planning both need to be better coordinated. So this particular criterion really addresses freight's needed role to be a good neighbor within the state's communities and for freight uses to be compatible and in alignment with local land use goals. And as planning for land use and transportation are performed through separate processes on different timelines, it's very important for the state and for the state's decision-making process to be accomplished with attention to local land use planning goals. Okay, so that's just another proposed criterion. And then the last one there on the screen, freight delay and reliability. And it's very important that we have freight routes that are reliable. We need freight routes that are uncongested. These are very important factors in supporting Alaska's economic productivity. Looking at delays that can be caused by congestion or poor roadway geometry, regulations, other factors that can contribute to delay. And I think we would all acknowledge that while you can have a long and unpredictable commuter time, that can be inconvenient, that can be costly for passenger travel. I think when we look at the time and the costs that are associated with delays in shipping, that can be substantially higher as costs of these freight delays are handed down, passed down to the consumer. All right, so that's just our initial listing of 5 or 6 different criteria that we were proposing just as a starting point. There were additional criteria that came to us from the Freight Advisory Committee. We'll spend a moment or two looking at some of these criteria, additional criteria that we heard from the Advisory Committee. Whether or not a roadway segment is a known safety corridor. If that's the case, if that would elevate that particular roadway segment in terms of its standing vis-a-vis other candidate projects. Some of the bullet points on here certainly have some overlap with the 6 that we covered on the previous slide, looking at resiliency, economic opportunity, number of freight modes, again, going back to the intermodal aspects of the criteria, inclusion in an approved local plan. That certainly ties right in with the previous criteria on local land use and local plan alignment. But in looking over the list here, did anyone have any additional recommended screening criteria? Now that we've gone through these in some more detail, did anyone have any additional thoughts or insights for the project team that we need to consider as we further develop this framework?
Brian, there's a question and then we'll go to Steve. Do all projects in the freight investment plan have to be physical infrastructure, or are planning projects eligible?
I am not sure. I'm not sure the answer to that question. Good question.
It says all phases, but I'm not sure if planning's included. I don't know if someone from DOT, Eric, do you happen to know?
Yeah, I'm looking up the USC citation right now.
Okay.
I give you eligible projects. Development phase activities, including planning, feasibility analysis, revenue forecasting, environmental review, preliminary engineering and design work, and other pre-construction activities. Obviously, construction. There's a whole list of eligible projects. Other eligible costs. States may use funds apportioned for carrying out diesel retrofit of alternative fuel projects. and the necessary costs of conducting analysis and data collection related to the National Highway Freight Program, developing and updating performance targets to carry out this section, and reporting to the administrator to comply with the freight performance target.
So we'll make sure we clarify that in the plan, and we'll make sure we have a list of the eligible projects. Thanks, Eric. Steve?
Yeah, thanks, Wendy. Hey, Claire, could you go back to your previous slide, please? Yeah. A question and then a suggestion on the financial criterion. Because you say, you know, when you show the explanation here, it says percentage of funds from non-state sources. But Brian, when you talked about it, you talked about private sector investment. Is it safe to say that, you know, that may be one of several non-state sources?
Yeah, I think so. I just use that as an example to illustrate what we're talking about there. But again, the whole intent would be, you know, is there a proposed project that wouldn't be relying so heavily on state funding? Are there other funding sources that are being brought to bear on the project?
Yeah, and I got to tell you, I think that is spot on, and I would suggest that you know because a non-state source could be, well, the port, for example. If we have dollars that we wanted to contribute to cover the cost of a project, we would like to be able, you know, to do that and have that recognized as perhaps our port users who are private sector might, or any other players along those lines. So I think that's a great criteria. I would change the name though from financial to something more representative of the theme you're going for. Because when I looked at this and I saw financial, the first thing that popped in my head was, oh God, the cheaper the project, the more successful it's going to be. You know, and because I work for the government and that's how my head operates. So I would suggest changing that to maybe non-state funding sources.
How about diversity of funding?
I'm sorry?
Diversity of funding sources?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, something
Okay.
that would drive the the reader and the folks that are doing the screening to appreciate that it's not all about which projects cost the least or cost the most, but how many stakeholders do you really have? And anybody that's willing to pony up some dollars to see something happen, that amount of recognition is really, really important. So I appreciate the thought on that one. Thank you.
I like the number of stakeholders too, to add some clarity there. I think that captures a lot.
Thank
Judy,
you for those.
Yeah, Judy said, or funding partners, number of funding partners, funding contributions. So we can wordsmith that. I think we've got the right intent. And then Aaron, does the project have to be in the MTP for those within the MPO areas? And I think that's what we're kind of looking at for screening criteria. I mean, we would leave that up to this group to discuss a little bit. Aaron, did you want to expand on that or make a recommendation?
Well, for our areas, we have a lot of other local plans, not just the MPO plans. And we, like, for example, FAST has a freight plan. We have a freight plan. So I would just need to know, does the project have to be in the AMATS MTP in order to be included in this plan, or can it just be drawn from any plan that's out there? And it's just kind of keeping that consistency of how MPOs are involved in the project selection process. Thank you.
So part of the criteria there could actually go under network. Is it identified as in an MPO as a priority freight network? So that might be a good qualification under network. Would that make sense to you, Aaron and Jackson?
I guess yes, if the MPOs have an actual identified freight network done. So for example, Mat-Su is potentially becoming an MPO soon and they may not have it ready to go. So we don't want to discount their needs as part of this. So we may need some flexibility there. Or if it's, something like that.
Okay, great. I think I understand the intent, so that's helpful. Thank you. Do these screening criteria feel reasonable? Do you feel like anything's missing? Does anything give you heartburn?
Or any omissions?
I think they're, I think that's pretty comprehensive. You put too many there, then you begin to dilute the whole process, I think.
I think they need to support the long-range transportation plan. Like, I think that should be a criteria. And if they only support one of the goals versus 6 of the goals. There could also be a criteria, which maybe is too much, but maybe it's a subset of local plan alignment. If a particular region is part of an economic development, like economic development region that's been officially recognized by the Department of, I forget which one it is, it's a federal department where you can apply to be, I have to look it up. Sorry. I'll put it in the chat. I'll look it up and figure it out. But it's a federal agency. You can apply to become an economic development region, and you work with many stakeholders. That's part of being designated one of those regions.
That's an excellent suggestion and could probably even be a subset of our network criteria.
I would prefer you do it that way. Make it part of one of these criteria here. Because I think private sector investors are going to care less about those kinds of squishy things than the necessity for the infrastructure in the first place. And I think, you know, you'll lean that way more often when you're talking about federal dollars paying for the whole thing. But when you're looking for private sector investment, I just don't think you should be getting that squishy. But it's a good idea to include it in one of these criteria as a consideration.
Okay, thank you. We also have a comment, which we've run into before, Judy, unorganized boroughs with no local planning. They don't have a local plan, so their project will never align and they'll always get dinged on this criteria. So that's something we need to consider and weigh. And then Marie said project readiness is probably a good criteria to elevate up. Does anyone have any thoughts on either of those?
Yeah, this is Aaron. What we actually do in our TIP criteria or MTP criteria is we have kind of like an alternative score that we give to areas that don't have like a local plan or like a land use plan. We provide some ability to give some score. It may not be as high as those that have a plan in place already, because you want to recognize the importance of putting your local land use plans together or local planning documents together. So it might be an option for you to think about like an alternative score you could give to areas like unorganized boroughs that don't have plans in place, but they're still identified as a need through like a resolution or some list they've put together saying these are our top priorities and here's why.
Perfect, thank you. What about thoughts on elevating project readiness up? We know it's a goal of the commissioner and has been a goal of DOT for a long time to get projects built more quickly. Easier said than done with federal restrictions, but there is a goal.
This is Eric. I go back to what Brian was saying originally. It's, you know, which came first, you know, the chicken or the egg? Which came first, the freight investment plan or the STIP? So yeah, you could put that in there, but the assumption with project readiness is that it's already in the STIP. and you're dealing with, can I substitute it for another project that's not going to be ready? So yeah, I think it's one of those things where at that point, it's already in the freight investment plan. But yeah, I could see exceptions for, where you're trying to make a sudden change. But ultimately, the goal in there is more for programming than it is for planning purposes.
Thanks, Eric. And someone else agreed with Eric, readiness should be shown in the STIP because then you've got the money programmed and you can build it. So it might be more appropriate at that next tier down. Is that it for today? We thought this would be a more lively meeting. Did we get it kind of right? In all fairness, we took most of it from all of our meetings, so, and what other states are doing. So Marie asked, these screening criteria are not going to be used to select projects for the STIP. So they will be used to select projects for the freight investment plan. Which ones you've got to have some kind of way to prioritize. This is a performance-based plan, so we're trying to look at a documented process. And then the STIP would pull from these plans or these projects. Joe?
Thank you. I need a quick clarification on when we were talking STIP, freight-wide long-range transportation. The projects listed in here are, you got them from members of the public, Central Region, Northern Region, South Coast Region planners. So they're already planned to be in the STIP, and then we're just reinforcing that? Or is it, I just have a problem with the chicken and the egg kind of statement. I mean.
So part of it, that's a really good way to frame this up, Joe. So as Claire mentioned, we have over 80 projects that people said, these should be our priority freight projects. How do you screen those 80 projects? So what we want is a process, a defensible process for how we're looking at these projects to know which should be in the freight investment plan. It has to be fiscally constrained. So when you get all of these project nominations, how do you decide, how does DOT decide which ones are part of the freight investment plan and then ultimately get carried forward into the STIP? So that's what the screening criteria is. Let's start whittling down this list of 80. Because every year there's always going to be more needs or more wants and needs than there is for money and ability to deliver. So we're trying to come up with a defensible process that people can count on. It will help them get their projects ready and competitive to go through the screening criteria.
One follow-up question then, and then I'll leave it to others. Historically and/or there can be a project that would be utilized by freight, but utilized by many other Alaskan motorists as well. I mean, when we're doing these criteria, I mean, wouldn't it be possible to sprinkle freight money over a project just to put it across the finish line and things of that nature? I mean, it almost seems like there's going to be one project that's get all freight dollars and all the rest of them. It just doesn't seem as useful as it could be, but we got used to
the freight dollars. Yeah, the freight dollars can be sprinkled over many projects. They can go, the freight projects are going to pull probably from other federal funding sources too. They're just so expensive. There's some cross-pollination, but these would be projects that would have perhaps just the regular fund, the regular federal funding. And on top of that, we could add the freight dollars. So this just tells you where the freight dollars can go. Does not preclude it from other funding sources. All right, Catherine.
Yes, thank you. My comment kind of goes back to what Aaron had asked about as far as, does this need to be in, or do these projects need to be in the MPO? long-range plans. And I'd say, obviously what you said was correct, but I'd also like to just kind of mention that if the plan is to take projects directly from this freight plan and put it into the STIP for funding, at that point, it does need to be in the MPO's long-range transportation plan if it needs to go in their TIP. So in essence, it does kind of need to come directly from a long-range plan or be included in that plan, because then it does trickle down to other plans that do have that requirement. So I just kind of like to point that out, that while it might not be required for this freight plan, it does trickle down and might cause issues later if you don't have that set in place at the top level.
Great clarification. And for the record, those 80 projects, they do include fast planning and AMATS freight projects. So we did carry those forward into those 80 projects. Jody?
First of all, I just put in the chat, what is NPO?
It's MPO, Metropolitan Planning Organization.
Oh,
And
okay, sorry. All right, I
that's
have
okay.
that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, we should avoid acronyms.
Is there an organization within DOT that is looking at multimodal or somehow coalescing multimodal? Because we're talking about freight here that crosses multiple modes and that freight dollars are available for multiple modes. But I am unaware of where we're capturing those kinds of projects.
Brian, do you want to just talk about how the freight plan is talking about the intermodal connectivity? And I assume you're talking air to sea to port. Well, sea to port's the same thing, to truck.
Or rail,
Yep.
or
Yeah, don't ask me
whatever
to.
it is. Yeah.
Is the question though a matter of how the department is organized as an institution to plan for multimodal freight? I mean, is that the question?
I think it's both, because the freight plan, from what I'm hearing, has dollars available to cross modes, but it doesn't seem to me like we have a structure in place to identify where those multimodal, first of all, what are those multimodal projects? And then two, how do they fit into here? I just, for aviation has an aviation system plan. But what if there are two projects in the aviation system plan that score higher than 5 projects that are currently listed in this plan, given whatever criteria we come up with, right? Or what if this multimodal project that you guys showed in an earlier slide about freight coming in and out on planes and barges scores higher than something else in this plan? Like, how are we wrapping our minds around how to start integrating the multimodal aspect here? Because it seems like that aspect, sorry, I didn't realize I didn't have my camera on. It seems like that aspect is being pushed by the federal government. And so how are we capturing that is my question.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I know some states have actually, tried to address that through, avoiding a siloed approach or the various chimneys that exist within the DOT. And some states have actually organized, multimodal deputates. They have a deputy who's provides oversight over all of those freight planning across multiple modes, whether it's aviation or rail freight or ports and waterways, it all comes under that one deputate within the DOT.
So I think that's something we can talk to DOT a little bit more about and look at that just in terms of policies and implementation strategies and see where that goes.
I really see that
Right.
more as an institutional issue.
Yeah. But that's a good comment. That's what we're hoping to come out of here too, are some policies and actions that we can start exploring.
I mean, we'll never get those kinds of projects onto a list like this unless we have a mechanism to get them into this list, right?
Right. And one of the
So-
challenges too is the color of money, right? As you
Sure.
know, federal aviation money is very restricted. Highway is very restricted. So you have that added challenge of what color is your money and what can it be used for?
But in this IIJA bill, here's a huge opportunity to capitalize. And if what we're looking at here is partly relative to that act, then it seems like maybe we should try to put that together somehow
All right.
to at least get on the list.
Get on the
Thank you.
list. And that, I mean, that's why we're going through the bill. That's why we're going through this exercise, is a lot of the actions and policies. We're kind of at the 11th hour. We're trying to make sure we help go through all of this and make sure we set DOT up to leverage as much of this short-term 5-year funding as they can. And also understanding that this funding runs out in 5 years, and after 5 years, everything will have to be maintained and operated. And will there be money for that? So just trying to be really transparent with that is, have to be cognizant of what happens next. Bruce?
Yes, I'm going to kind of answer the multimodal question once I figure out how to take my hand down. Basically, a lot of the states that have multimodal programs have set those up through state dollars because the federal dollars are still very constrained in what they can and cannot be spent for. And one of the things, Eric, is I understand, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the majority of these state planning dollars are still largely going to be formula funds, and all the multimodal stuff will be through some formula funds, but then that's where the discretionary programs are going to be more important. So I'm just clarifying, Eric, is that how you're viewing this planning effort, is largely still formula dollars and then discretionary dollars to match any gaps?
Yeah, correct. I think, and that's to your credit, Bruce. I think you're opening a lot of eyes in at least at the commissioner's office level and maybe at the governor's office level as well, to the possibilities when we consider the discretionary dollar sources. One of the things we're examining within the department is actually setting up a cell, if you will, of folks whose primary responsibility is going to be going after the discretionary pots to augment the funding coming into the state. Again, it's federal funding, and discretionary dollars, still have a money color to them. So there's only things they can be used for. But the idea is to take that list of projects that Brian was talking about, and some we can program with what we have apportioned, but there's going to be other opportunities to implement some of these projects through the use of discretionary dollars.
Well, Eric, I stand to assist as needed. So.
I can assure you that every state is grappling with the new bill, and A, what plans need in place to even get the formula funds, and then B, how to leverage those discretionary funds. So,
Yeah, and
Not to
a lot
mention
of
this-
states are also struggling with the personnel issue. I mean, do they even have the staff in place to handle these programs and to move them through the, for lack of a better word, the anaconda swallowing the elephant?
yeah,
Yeah.
it's, we have the driving factor of workforce. How's that going to impact the delivery of transportation services? And I tell you what, every agency is short just on planning staff, engineers, from snowplow drivers to pilots and ferry operators. So I think everybody's exhausted right now that I've talked to, trying to come up with a plan, get all this done, and keep sane. So workforce is a big issue nationwide. All right, well, that is all we had. If there's nothing else, the next time you'll see us will be to talk about the draft plan. So you'll have one more time to see all of it come together. And the final will be in August, so the draft plan comes to everybody about mid-May. And you'll be able to see what we got right, what we missed. We'll have one more chance to comment. We feel pretty confident we've captured all of the Freight Advisory Committee's comments and concerns. So in the meantime, you can certainly reach out to us via email. We're happy to take it. We're happy to take phone calls. We want to make sure we get this as close to right as possible. And the tech memos are published on the webpage, Alaska Moves. I think there's a slide. Is there one more slide on there? AlaskaMoves2050.com. So the tech memos, all the summaries from these meetings are there. And I think that's all we have. I thank you for your time as always. It's been a pleasure working through this with you, and I look forward to sharing the draft.
Thank you.
Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you. Night.
Good night.